brand new driveway in a quiet American suburb split down the middle in less than 4 months, and the homeowners had no idea their concrete was doomed before the truck even finished pouring it. What looks like solid, permanent stone is actually one of the most fragile materials on a job site during its first 72 hours, and almost nobody watching it get poured understands that. If you're a homeowner, a contractor, or someone who just wants to know what's really happening under your feet before you spend thousands of dollars on a slab, patio, or foundation, subscribe now, because every week we dig into the construction mistakes that quietly cost American families a fortune. At first glance, this story looks completely ordinary. A concrete crew shows up early on a warm morning. The truck rolls in right on schedule, and within a few hours, a smooth, gray driveway stretches across the front of a brand new home. The homeowners are thrilled. The surface is flat, the edges are clean, and everything about it looks like a job well done. But concrete is not glass, and it's not stone, even though it eventually behaves like both. In its first hours, it is closer to a living chemical reaction than a finished building material. And that reaction can be interrupted, rushed, or sabotaged in ways that don't show up until it's far too late to fix cheaply. What most people never realize is that the moment concrete leaves the mixing truck, an invisible clock starts ticking. The cement, water, sand, and gravel inside that gray slurry are beginning a process called hydration, where the cement particles chemically bond with water to form a hardened structure. This isn't drying out like a puddle evaporating in the sun. It's closer to a slow-motion crystallization, and if that process gets disturbed, the final result can be a slab that looks perfect on day one and starts cracking apart weeks or months later. Here's where things start to go wrong for a shocking number of driveways, patios, and foundations across the country. The most common and most damaging mistake happens before a single drop of concrete even touches the ground. And it has nothing to do with the concrete itself. It's the ground underneath it. Contractors call this the subgrade, and it's essentially the compacted soil or gravel base that the slab will sit on. When that base isn't properly compacted, or when loose, soft, or organic soil is left underneath instead of being dug out and replaced, the concrete above it has no stable foundation to rely on. At first, it doesn't seem like a serious problem. The slab gets poured, it looks flawless, and the homeowner moves on with their life. But underneath the surface, that loose soil is slowly settling under the weight of the concrete, shifting with every rainstorm, every freeze, and every change in moisture. As the ground beneath shifts unevenly, the rigid slab above it has nowhere to go except to crack, because concrete has almost no flexibility. It can handle enormous compression, meaning it resists being crushed extremely well. But it's remarkably weak when it comes to bending or stretching. When the earth beneath it moves even slightly in one section but not another, the slab is forced to bend, and since it can't bend, it breaks instead. This is why so many cracked driveways and sunken patios trace back to a mistake nobody could see on pour day. The visible surface told one story, smooth and impressive, while the invisible ground beneath told a completely different one, soft and unstable. Professional crews solve this by excavating down to solid, undisturbed soil, then building up a compacted gravel base in careful layers, checking the density with specialized equipment before ever allowing concrete near the site. Cutting corners here saves an afternoon of labor and a few $100s, but it can cost a homeowner thousands in repairs just a few years later. But the subgrade isn't the only hidden threat working against a fresh pour, and what happens next often does even more damage. Once the concrete truck arrives, there's enormous pressure to keep things moving fast. Concrete becomes harder to work with the longer it sits in the truck, so crews are often racing against time, especially on a hot day. This is where one of the most common and most misunderstood mistakes in the entire industry takes place, and it happens right in front of the homeowner without them ever noticing anything unusual. To make the concrete easier to pour, spread, and finish, some crews add extra water to the mix right at the job site. It seems harmless. The concrete becomes noticeably smoother and easier to work with, almost like thinning out paint so it spreads more easily. But this single decision, made in seconds with a garden hose, can quietly destroy the long-term strength of the entire slab. Concrete is engineered with a very specific ratio of water to cement, and that ratio determines the final strength of the hardened material. Adding water beyond what the mix design calls for dramatically weakens the finished product, sometimes cutting its strength by a significant margin, even though it looks identical to properly mixed concrete once it's smoothed over. What happens next surprised even experienced builders when researchers began studying it closely. A slab poured with too much extra water can look completely normal for months, sometimes even for a year or two, because the surface still hardens and still resembles a solid structure. But underneath that convincing exterior, the concrete is now full of microscopic air pockets and weaknesses left behind as the extra water eventually evaporates out. Those tiny voids become starting points for cracks, and they also make the surface far more vulnerable to something almost every part of the country experiences at least once a year: the freeze-thaw cycle. This is where the story becomes especially relevant for homeowners living anywhere that gets cold winters. Water that seeps into those microscopic voids inside weakened concrete expands when it freezes, the same way a full water bottle left in a freezer will crack or burst. Every freeze and thaw cycle pushes tiny amounts of pressure into those weak points, and over years, this invisible process turns a smooth slab into a spider web of surface cracks and crumbling edges. Professional concrete companies avoid this disaster entirely by using specific chemical additives called plasticizers, which make the concrete easier to pour and finish without changing the water to cement ratio at all. It costs a little more, but it protects the integrity of the slab for decades instead of years. At this point, the story might seem like it's mostly about what happens before or during the pour, but the truth is that some of the costliest mistakes happen after the concrete has already been placed and looks finished. This next part is where most homeowners have absolutely no idea what's happening, because by the time the truck leaves the site, they assume the hard part is over. It isn't. The most critical and most frequently ignored stage in the entire process is called curing, and it might be the single biggest reason concrete cracks prematurely across the country. Curing isn't about letting the concrete dry out. In fact, that's the exact opposite of what should happen. Concrete needs to stay moist for an extended period after it's poured, so the hydration reaction can continue properly, allowing the material to reach its full designed strength. If the surface dries out too quickly, especially within the first 24 to 48 hours, the hydration process stops before it's finished, leaving the concrete significantly weaker than it was designed to be. This is where the biggest mistake hadn't even happened yet, even though the slab already looked done. A hot, sunny day with a light breeze, which sounds like perfect weather for outdoor work, is actually one of the worst possible conditions for freshly poured concrete. The sun and wind pull moisture out of the surface far faster than the hydration process can use it, causing the top layer to dry and shrink, while the concrete underneath is still wet and expanding. This mismatch creates intense internal stress right at the surface, and that stress often shows up as a pattern of thin, spiderweb-like cracks called plastic shrinkage cracking. Homeowners frequently notice these cracks within days of the pour, and assume something went catastrophically wrong, when in reality, it's often just a sign that nobody protected the surface from drying out too fast. Professional crews prevent this by actively keeping the concrete moist for at least several days after pouring, sometimes using wet burlap, plastic sheeting, or specialized curing compounds that lock moisture into the surface. On hot or windy days, some crews even set up temporary windbreaks or spray fine mists of water over the slab throughout the day. It's an unglamorous, almost invisible part of the job, but skipping it is one of the fastest ways to guarantee cracking, no matter how well everything else was done. Now comes the part that costs homeowners the most money, and it involves a mistake that isn't really a mistake in execution, but a mistake in planning. Concrete naturally expands and contracts with temperature changes throughout the year, and even without any errors in mixing or curing, it will always try to move slightly. Because concrete can't stretch, engineers solve this problem using something called control joints, which are strategically placed grooves cut into the slab that create intentional weak points. The idea is almost clever in its simplicity. Instead of letting the concrete crack randomly and unpredictably across the surface, control joints guide the inevitable cracking into straight, nearly invisible lines that blend into the design of the slab. But here's where everything can go wrong, even on a job that was mixed and cured perfectly. If those control joints are spaced too far apart, or if they're cut too shallow, or worst of all, if they're skipped entirely to save time, the concrete has no controlled path to release its natural stress. Instead of cracking neatly along an engineered line, it cracks wherever it wants, often right through the middle of a driveway or across a patio, in a jagged, unattractive line that immediately catches the eye and lowers the value of the entire installation. There's a general guideline professionals follow, spacing control joints based on the thickness of the slab, and skipping this step is one of those invisible decisions that seems fine on poor day, but becomes an expensive, visible problem within the first year. This hidden detail changes everything about how people should evaluate a finished concrete job. A driveway with a few straight, clean joint lines running across it isn't a flaw. It's actually a sign that whoever installed it understood how concrete behaves and planned for its natural movement, instead of hoping it wouldn't happen. Meanwhile, a driveway that looks perfectly smooth and joint-free when it's brand new might actually be a warning sign, especially if it eventually develops random cracks that weren't part of any design. There's one more critical mistake almost nobody notices, and it involves reinforcement. The steel bars or wire mesh embedded inside a concrete slab to help it resist cracking and hold together even if stress does occur. Reinforcement doesn't prevent concrete from cracking entirely, but it does something incredibly important. It holds the material together if cracking happens, keeping small cracks from turning into large, dangerous separations where sections of concrete shift or heave in different directions. The problem is that reinforcement only works if it's placed correctly inside the slab. And this is another one of those details that's completely invisible once the pour is finished. Steel reinforcement needs to sit within the concrete at a specific depth, generally positioned in the upper middle portion of the slab, where it can resist the stresses concrete experiences most. Some crews, either through inexperience or an attempt to save time, simply lay the wire mesh directly on the ground before pouring, assuming the weight of the concrete will push it up into the correct position as it's poured. This almost never happens the way people hope. Instead, the reinforcement often stays exactly where it started, sitting at the very bottom of the slab, or sometimes it gets accidentally stepped on and pushed down during the pour, ending up buried uselessly near the base, where it does almost nothing to prevent surface cracking. Professional crews use small plastic or metal supports called chairs to hold the reinforcement at the correct height throughout the entire pour, ensuring it actually does its job once the concrete hardens around it. Most homeowners never notice this detail because it's completely hidden, and unless a slab eventually cracks badly enough to be professionally inspected, nobody ever finds out the reinforcement was in the wrong place the whole time. This is part of what makes concrete such a deceptive material to work with. So many of the decisions that determine whether a slab lasts for decades or fails within a few years happen in moments that leave no visible trace on the finished surface. As if the ground beneath, the water content, the curing process, the joint spacing, and the reinforcement placement weren't enough variables to manage correctly. Weather itself introduces another layer of risk that catches plenty of contractors off guard. Pouring concrete in cold weather, especially when temperatures drop toward freezing, creates a dangerous situation because the hydration reaction that gives concrete its strength slows down dramatically in cold conditions. And if the water inside the fresh concrete actually freezes before the mixture has gained enough strength, ice crystals can physically damage the internal structure of the slab, sometimes permanently weakening it before it ever gets the chance to properly cure. This is why professional crews working in colder regions of the country often use insulated blankets to cover fresh concrete, sometimes combined with temporary heating equipment to keep the material warm enough for the hydration process to continue safely during the critical first days. Skipping this precaution to save money on a cold weather pour is one of the more dangerous shortcuts in the industry, because the damage caused by early freezing often isn't obvious until much later, when the slab starts showing signs of scaling, flaking, or crumbling at the surface, sometimes within the very first winter after installation. On the opposite end of the spectrum, pouring concrete during extreme heat introduces its own set of dangerous shortcuts. High temperatures speed up the hydration process so much that the concrete can begin setting before crews have finished properly finishing and smoothing the surface. This often leads to what's known as cold joints, which happen when one section of concrete begins hardening before the next section is poured against it, preventing the two sections from properly bonding together into a single, unified slab. Instead, there's a hidden seam running through the concrete, where two separate pores never fully merged, creating a natural weak point that often becomes one of the first places a visible crack appears. Experienced concrete companies plan around weather constantly, sometimes scheduling pours for early morning hours during summer to avoid the most intense heat, or bringing in extra crew members on hot days specifically to keep the pace of finishing work ahead of the concrete's accelerated setting time. It's one of the clearest examples of how a professional approach to concrete work isn't really about the material itself. It's about understanding and respecting the conditions the material is being placed in, then adjusting the entire process accordingly. When you put all of these pieces together, the ground preparation, the water content, the curing process, the joint placement, the reinforcement positioning, and the weather conditions, it becomes clear why concrete cracking is almost never caused by a single dramatic failure. Instead, it's usually the result of several small, invisible decisions made across just a few hours on pour day. Decisions that don't show any consequences until months or even years later, long after the crew has moved on to their next job, and the homeowner has completely forgotten about the process that created their driveway, patio, or foundation. This is exactly why understanding these hidden mistakes matters so much for anyone about to invest in concrete work. A homeowner who knows to ask about subgrade preparation, who understands that adding extra water at the site is a red flag rather than a convenience, who knows curing needs to happen over several days rather than being skipped once the surface looks dry, and who recognizes that clean, straight joint lines are a sign of good planning rather than a flaw, is in a completely different position than someone who simply watches concrete get poured and assumes a smooth surface means a job well done. The driveway that split apart in just a few months wasn't cursed with bad luck, and the concrete itself wasn't defective. It was simply the final, visible result of decisions made long before anyone could see a problem. Decisions about soil compaction, water content, curing time, and joint placement that all quietly determined its fate the moment the truck rolled away. Concrete has a reputation for being one of the toughest, most permanent materials used in American homes, and when it's done right, that reputation is completely earned. But it takes more than a smooth finish to get there. It takes patience, correct preparation, and a respect for a chemical process that continues working long after the crew has packed up their tools and left for the day. If this investigation changed the way you'll look at your own driveway, patio, or foundation, there's a whole world of hidden construction problems still waiting to be uncovered, and we'll be digging into the next one soon. So make sure you're subscribed and come back for the next investigation.